Oh, okay. There you are. Um, Trying something a little bit different. I got a new pad for operating this camera. So, welcome to our online confirmation. And today we're going to be talking about David. Do you know who he is? Have you heard about David? King David? He is like the ultimate hero for the Israelites. And you'll find his story in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And it begins innocently enough, but he rises to become their greatest king. He's their greatest hero. We call Jesus Son of David. And that's because he traces his genealogy goes back to King David, and that's because God made a promise to David when God anointed him king. He said, "Here is a man after my own heart, and you will always have one of your descendants will always sit on the throne of Israel." And so Jesus, being king of the world, is also king of Israel, the newborn king that the three magi were looking for. And that King Herod wanted to get rid of in the Christmas story. So King David, fascinating character. It's a good story to read, especially if you like action and adventure. A lot of wars, a lot of fighting. King David was a warrior king, and when he didn't go to war is when he got in trouble. He was beloved of God. God said he was a man after God's own heart, and yet he was not perfect. He had his faults. And when you read the story of King David, they leave the faults in there. They don't whitewash him to make him seem superhuman. They put everything in there. His triumphs, his defeats, when he obeyed God, when he disobeyed God, everything. So it begins small enough. King David was a shepherd. And the first story that we really have of King David is David versus Goliath. Have you heard that? So we back up a little bit. David was the second king of Israel. We had talked about the judges, Deborah. We didn't really talk about Samson. Samson was a judge, but there were a whole bunch of judges. But Israel kept looking at all these countries that kept invading them and that they kept fighting with, and they saw that everybody around them had a king. So they wanted a king. And God is like, "No, you don't want a king." And they're like, "Yes, we want a king." And so God said, "Okay, I'll give you a king, but here's what's going to happen. The king is going to tax you. He's going to take 1/10 of your farmland, of your produce. He's going to take 1/10. He's going to take your of everything you own for taxes. He's going to take your sons and he's going to put them in his army. And he's going to take your daughters, and they're going to come and they're going to be servants and cooks and house cleaners and everything for King David." He said these things will happen. And they did happen. But the people of Israel were still adamant. They're like, "We want a king." And so the first king that God raised up for him was this guy named Saul. And the Bible says he was handsome beyond handsome. And he was tall. He was head and shoulders taller than everyone else. And so he was a guy that looked like a king. And he led the Israelites to some victories. But he also did some things that were wrong. The Bible says in the eyes of the Lord, he suffered from extreme migraines that caused him some severe pain. And the only thing that would relieve him was if he could just rest peacefully. And that's where David comes in, because when David first meets Saul, it's because of his talent of playing the harp and playing soothing music. And so King David played music. And this was after. So Saul was the first king, and he did things bad in the eyes of the Lord. So God sent Samuel, who was the main prophet at that time, to go and anoint a son of Jesse. Remember that when we talked about Ruth, that she had a child named Obed, and Obed had a child named Jesse, and Jesse had, I think, 6 or 7 boys, and David was the youngest. And so Samuel anointed him as king, as the chosen one, to lead Israel. But they already had a king. They had Saul. And so David was smart enough to wait his time, because he recognized that Saul also had been anointed by God, even though he had found disfavor. So he's in Saul's court, and he plays the harp for him. And half of the Psalms that we have, there's 150 Psalms in the Bible, 73 of them are attributed to David, that David wrote these. And so David's at the court. The Philistines come again, and you know they're battling with the Philistines again. And the Philistines have this huge warrior, bigger than everyone else. It's like Shaq. For you guys that follow basketball. Shaq was huge. He was 7 feet tall. He's bigger than everybody else on the basketball court. That's what this Philistine was. And nobody could match him in battle. And so the two armies, they're faced off against each other, but they really didn't fight, you know, and Goliath was calling out and teasing, you know, he was trash talking the Israelites, saying, "Come on, don't you have anybody that'll come and fight me? Come on." And David was still a kid. And he wasn't a member of the army at that time yet. But he had gone to visit his brothers who were in the army and to bring them some food from their dad to feed them. And he heard Goliath. And he's like talking to his brother and says, Why do you let him do that? And they're like, because nobody can fight this guy. He's bigger than everybody else. He's stronger than everybody else. He's faster than everybody else. David says, I'll take him on. And so he goes to the king and says, I'll go out and fight him. I'll be, it's the word I'm looking for. Not hero, but, you know, I'll be your champion. And I'll go out and fight him. And so they tried to put armor on him, but David was too small. None of the armor fit. And he says, no, just take it off. And he walks out there, and Goliath sees in full armor, and he's got this huge sword, and he sees this little kid come out. He's got a sling by his side, because that's what he uses as a shepherd. That's what he uses, sling and stones to chase the wolves away from the sheep. And Goliath starts laughing at him, and he starts making fun of the Israelites and says, who is this pipsqueak? And he comes forward to do battle. And then David he takes his slingshot and he starts whirling it around, and he lets fly with the stone, and he hits Goliath in the head. Hard enough that it knocks him out. It didn't kill him, it knocked him out. Goliath falls down face first. Boom. Everybody's stunned. They don't know what to do. David, he runs up, he grabs the sword out of Goliath's hand, he stabs him with it, kills it with him, and he cuts off his head. And then the rest of the Philistines, they take off as the Israelite army charges. That was the beginning of David's career in the army. And he quickly rose in rank till he was one of the captains. And the people, and he just kept winning. He kept winning, and the people started chanting, that he's a true hero of the country. And then Saul got jealous of him. And then, we read the rest of the story. While Saul is still king, Saul chases him out of his court, and he tries to kill him. And David had chances to kill him a couple of times, and he doesn't. Till finally Saul falls in battle with the Philistines. And then David is anointed king. And then once he's king, things aren't rosy either. Somebody else raises a rebellion against him that he's got to put down. His own son, after a while, wants to claim the kingship and raises a rebellion against him, and he's got to put that down. One day, when it was springtime, and the Bible says the kings go out to war, but David decided, just stay back for a while. I don't want to go to war yet. So he's back in his castle. He had captured Jerusalem. The whole while the Israelites were in Israel, Jerusalem was still there, and it was still a stronghold for a tribe called the Jebusites. And nobody could defeat them because Jerusalem is up on a hill. And you play king of the hill, it's hard to knock that guy down. So David crawled up the aqueduct pipes and entered the city that way and took the city. And then he made it his stronghold. So that's how Jerusalem got known as David's city. And that's where he built his house. That's where he built his castle. And so anyway, he's there, and he's in his castle, and he looks out across the way, and there's this woman she's on the rooftop taking a bath, and he's like, oh, she looks pretty good. I'm going to invite her over for dinner. But she's already married. She's married to one of his, one of the leaders of his army. But he invites her over anyway, and he seduces her, and he has sex with her, and gets her pregnant. And then he's like, uh-oh. Well, so then he calls to the front where they were fighting, and he brings her husband back home, thinking that, if he's back home on leave, he'll have sex with his wife. But he didn't do that. He said, all my men are out there and they're away from their families. Why should I enjoy my family when they can't? So he doesn't. So then David goes to plan B, and he sends them back to the front with orders to give to the general to put him in the front line, leading the charge against whatever city they're attacking. And those in the front line usually get killed. And Uriah eventually was killed in one of the charges. God did not like that. God did not like that at all. He sent the prophet Nathan to go and talk to David and and give an illustration of what was going wrong, and which Nathan did. And once David realized he did wrong, then he repented and he prayed and he asked God for forgiveness, and God forgave him. But that child, as a lot of children did back then, died within the first year of its life. But then he had another son by Bathsheba. That's what this woman's name was, Bathsheba. And they named him Solomon. And he inherited the throne from David. There is a lot more to David's story. There is a ton more. There's a scene where, he wants to build a temple to God, but God says, no, don't, because your hands are full of blood, because you're a warrior king. Let your son Solomon build my temple. So David collected all the materials for it, but he didn't build it. He waited for Solomon to build it. And the last thing that he brought in to the city of Jerusalem was the Ark of the Covenant, which was this wooden chest that they had made when they were wandering in the wilderness, when Moses was leading them. And in there was, a jar of manna that was there, and Aaron's staff was in there, and there's some other stuff that was in there, and it was like the place where you would find God. When they set the ark up, they set this elaborate tent up, and that's how they built the temple, was to resemble that tent that they had used when they were wandering, with the ark in the very center, inside, separated from the people, because that is where God would sit. And so there's this scene in the Bible where he's bringing the ark into Jerusalem, and he's dancing in there, and he's naked, and he's dancing, and his wife sees him dancing naked. She doesn't like it. She gets mad at him. And then you have that whole story. But, David is a character. He is beloved of God. God set the kingdom of Israel, set his people into David's hands, made the promise that always a son of David would be seated on the throne of Israel. And God kept that promise. It's one of the names that, as I said, that we call Jesus as Son of David, because of that promise of God. And so when people look for the Messiah to come, they look for somebody in David's line. But he wasn't perfect. Like us, he had his flaws. Like us, he did good things and he did bad things. When he realized he was doing bad things, he would stop and he would ask God for forgiveness. But that didn't stop him from doing it again. As great of a king that David was, as great of a hero that he is and that he's remembered to be, he was just one of us. No more perfect, no less perfect. He had his flaws. So thank you for joining me as we talk about King David. Next, we'll talk about his son, Solomon, before we move on into one of the prophets. But hopefully next week we can be together in person. But until then, have a blessed week.